Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Solar+Storage in Net Metering Programs. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group and the Clean Energy States Alliance with support from the Barr Foundation. The Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, is a membership organization of state clean energy funds from across the country. And on the screen now, you can see logos from some of our member organizations. CESA does a lot of work on energy storage through our SSTAT program, and this is the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership. SSTAT is conducted under partnership with Sandia National Laboratories and is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Electricity. And through SSTAT, we've done projects and supported state energy storage policy development all over the country. We also do a lot of webinars under the SSTAT program. This webinar is also being presented by Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project. The Resilient Power Project does a lot of webinars, analysis, and reporting, and it also supports projects across the country with an Energy Storage Technical Assistance Fund. And so far, we've helped support over 100 projects across the country. You can learn more about the Resilient Power Project at resilient-power.org. And here are some of the foundations that support Clean Energy Group. So today for our webinar, we have 3 speakers with us on the line. First, we have Jin No. Jin is a senior consultant at Strategen. Jin works with the California Energy Storage Alliance, also known as CESA. This is an industry trade association of over 70 member companies representing all types and scales of technologies and projects in the energy storage ecosystem. Jin manages regulatory affairs and policy on behalf of CESA at the CPUC, Casio, and the CEC, covering a range of issues affecting the energy storage market, including grid planning, wholesale market design, interconnection standards, and programs and tariffs. Next, we'll be hearing from Jaime Dickerson. Jaime is a policy analyst at the Northeast Clean Energy Council. And in this role, he helps to develop and coordinate legislative and regulatory advocacy with the policy team there and with external partners in the Northeast. His policy advocacy has focused on a wide range of matters pertaining to grid and distributed scale clean energy resources, including solar and distributed generation, net metering, energy storage, energy efficiency, large-scale procurement, grid modernization and rate design, and more. And finally, we have with us on the line Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a project director at Clean Energy Group and the Clean Energy States Alliance, where he works on issues related to energy storage and directs our SSTAT project. Todd will be moderating this webinar. He'll be leading the Q&A following our presentations. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Jin No for his presentation. And after that, we will hear from Jaime. And finally, we'll save some room for a Q&A at the end.
Morning, everyone. This is Jin No from the California Energy Storage Alliance. I'm the policy manager here. And one of the key areas that I cover is the net energy metering proceeding. And so I'm here to talk today. Welcomed here by the Clean Energy State Alliance. Thank you for having me here to discuss a little more about NEM plus storage policies in California and some of the lessons learned that could be exported to, potentially other states as well. Just a little quick background on what CESA does, the California CESA. So we're a 501c6 membership-based advocacy group, and we're committed to, and our mission is to, really advance the role of energy storage in the electric power sector through various means, through policy, advocacy, education of stakeholders, outreach, and policy research. And so, we're involved in multiple different state agencies here in California, at the ISO, the California Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission here in California, as well as the legislature. And so we're very active regarding NEM policies in each of these venues. We're a membership-based advocacy organization composed of over 70 plus members, and you can see just a list of them here, many of which are involved in the net energy metering tariff here. So just wanted to quickly start with how NEM is structured here in California. I'm sure many of you are aware of NEM concepts and how NEM is generally applied, but I wanted to give you a little bit of perhaps some of the specific California-specific nuances to NEM here in this state. So the net energy metering tariff here in California, it's really intended to offset part or all of the customer's electrical requirements, and only provide NEM credits for electricity that's actually produced from NEM eligible generation. And so this underpins a lot of the NEM integrity issues for when energy storage is paired with NEM eligible generation, and also ties into how these resources are compensated. So the way NEM works here in California is that generally NEM systems are eligible for financial credits for any power generated by their on-site systems that is fed back into the grid for use by other customers. And this true-up is done over an annual cycle, with NEM credits also being calculated over the course of a billing cycle, which is done monthly here in California. And so generally the NEM credits are valued at the same dollar per kilowatt hour that customers would otherwise be charged, i.e. the retail rate. And any NEM credits over one billing period carries forward to offset the next month's electricity bill. And all of this, again, is trued up at the end of the year. And since NEM is really intended to offset the customer's consumption, any customer production that's in excess of one's on-site load over an annual period is actually compensated at what's called a net surplus compensation rate. And so this is significantly lower than the retail rate, and is generally valued around the avoided wholesale generation rate. And so I think these are all important factors in determining how NEM is structured here in California and how storage plays into it as well. So just wanted to start off with some of those basics. So the key reform that happened with NEM policy here in California was a decision back in 2016 that adopted the NEM successor tariff, what we call here NEM 2.0. Generally, there weren't too many changes made to NEM policies. The retail rate compensation for exports was maintained, and the only key change was that NEM customers still have to pay non-bypassable charges. So previously under NEM 1.0, these non-bypassable charges could also be offset, but there was a small change with the NEM successor tariff that required these non-bypassable charges to be paid for regardless of your NEM generation. And there were also a whole host of other key changes to the NEM successor tariff that was made related to interconnection fees, requiring customers to go on TOU rates as each of the utilities here in California transitioned to default residential TOU rates in 2019 and 2020. But there are opt-in TOU rates that now NEM 2.0 customers must take service under. There's also changes to the virtual net energy metering policy to mirror that of the regular NEM tariff. And there are also grandfathering provisions established for NEM 1.0 customers, as well as NEM 2.0 customers for 20 years. This is to support the financeability of NEM investments. And so all in all, I think the NEM 2.0 tariff, during the deliberations in the proceeding, there was a lot of discussion of what is the appropriate rate at which we should value NEM exports, whether that should be some value of solar rate whether that should be, the wholesale generation avoided rate, or, maintaining some level of full retail. And there were a number of other options considered. But because, the state is actually transitioning toward default residential TOU rates in 2019, 2020, the commission decided that, customers shouldn't be subject to too much change, that they decided to maintain many elements of NEM 1.0 in NEM 2.0. So with that, there's been a number of decisions even before that NEM 2.0 tariff that really drove investments of paired storage systems with NEM eligible generation. And so I wanted to go over some of these factors here today. There's NEM paired storage policies around interconnection and metering, sizing limitations, credit estimation methodologies, storage systems also being eligible for incentive programs here in California, and how there's even economic drivers for more paired storage systems. Even though they're not direct drivers, they're economic drivers that incentivize the pairing of storage systems through through the NEM 2.0 TOU requirement, as well as recent rate cases that have adopted new TOU periods. And also, on a going forward basis, and even currently, even though there's barriers today to NEM paired storage systems actually being eligible and participating in utility solicitations for specific grid services, that could be RA capacity, distribution deferral, providing that distribution capacity and whatnot. So there's a number of future opportunities for NEM paired storage systems as well. So starting with interconnection and metering, I think this is one of the key policy drivers for NEM paired storage systems. As noted before, really the intent is to ensure that all exports to the grid from NEM eligible generation is truly produced from that NEM eligible generator. And so there are requirements to ensure, whether through metering, to ensure that any exports or any energy that's frankly stored in the energy storage system is actually generated from that NEM eligible generation, as opposed to being charged from the grid, which is not eligible for NEM credits. And so, a key development there was, several key decisions that cited the RPS guidebook here in California that, broader than just the NEM context, they determined that, energy storage devices that are actually paired with an eligible renewable generator, they're considered an addition or enhancement to that renewable generator, and should therefore be eligible for any specific credits that renewable generator can provide. And so that could be renewable energy credits here in California for RPS generation, but also, in the NEM proceeding for behind the meter system, they apply this similar types of principles for NEM generation to allow for these credits to be had for the paired storage system, so long as these systems are proven to be integrated or directly connected storage devices. And as a result of that, a lot of the special provisions in place for NEM eligible generation also extended to the paired storage system as well. But to really enact those policies and to really ensure that to ensure NEM integrity, a number of metering requirements had to be adopted, had to be considered and adopted. And so through a 2014 decision by the California Public Utilities Commission, they approved a set of metering configurations that could potentially streamline the process for ensuring NEM integrity during the interconnection process. So, first for small systems, they decided not to adopt any metering requirements, and instead proposed to use an estimation methodology to validate eligible NEM credits, and I'll discuss more on that later. But for large systems, energy storage systems that are greater than 10 kW are required to actually comply with a set of metering requirements that are laid out in the NEM-MT tariff here in California. So, one option could be to install a non-export relay on the storage device. This, automatically ensures that, NEM credits are inappropriately assigned to storage exports that might be charged from the grid. So basically, the storage device is purely used to serve on-site consumption, self-consumption. The second option could be installing an interval meter on all points of that NEM pair storage system at the load, at the point of common coupling, and also for the NEM eligible generation to really be able to account for where energy is going in and out to ensure NEM integrity. And the last option is to install a meter to the NEM eligible generator, but this doesn't really apply to NEM pair storage systems since there's no way to account for NEM integrity under this configuration. So really the first two options are the metering configurations adopted, and this has really helped streamline NEM pair storage interconnections as well, while ensuring NEM integrity. One of the things that we're still here in California trying to improve upon in terms of this metering framework is that ideally it would be great to meter everything to account for where energy is going in and out to verify NEM integrity. But in lieu of metering everything, since meters generally do cost a lot and they could be potentially cost prohibitive, especially for the smaller C&I systems and slightly larger residential systems, the state is really exploring, and organizations like CISA and the California Solar+Storage Association are trying to push the state and the utilities to consider inverter software controls. So instead of installing costly metering, potentially we could use verified and certified software controls to ensure that NEM integrity is upheld. This offers much more operational flexibility, potentially as TOU periods change as well. But the challenge has been getting buy-in from the utilities to be sure that the NEM customer doesn't actually change those software configurations, to ensure that there are cybersecurity measures put in place to not allow for outside parties to potentially hack these systems. And also the challenge has really been around utility engineers who are electrical engineers by training, not software engineers, to be able to review that software and be able to be sure that NEM integrity is upheld. And so this is where standards definitely come in place, and a number of standards are in the process of being developed. And also, one key gap in this metering framework is, the currently approved metering configurations don't necessarily work well for DC coupled and NEM pair storage systems. Without revenue grade DC meters in place at the moment, this has been a challenge. How can we use the current configurations to potentially verify NEM integrity? And one of those options, in addition to software controls, is to potentially consider how the inverters can actually be configured to prevent any grid charging, or to potentially install non-import relays as opposed to non-export relays. No storage export controls are also possibilities. And so this is a frontier that we're trying to consider more as DC coupled NEM pair storage systems become more prevalent on the grid. And then lastly, related to this specific topic is in that same decision, the Commission adopted some limitations on the sizing of energy storage systems. And so again, since the NEM policy is intended to support customers to serve their on-site customer load, they didn't want paired energy storage systems to be oversized to potentially serve beyond that, and also to prevent any concerns about NEM integrity for oversized systems that could potentially charge from the grid. And so they adopted policies to allow for no sizing requirements for NEM pair storage systems that are less than 10 kW. They didn't think this policy was necessarily needed for some of these small systems that are generally not incentivized to oversize their storage systems. But for larger systems, there was a cap at 150% of the NEM generator's maximum output capacity. And this is again to ensure that the NEM generator already has sizing limitations to the customer load, but they also wanted to tie the pair storage system sizing limitations to that NEM generator and also to that on-site customer load as well. All right. Another interesting, policy tool that has been developed is a NEM pair storage bill credit estimation methodology, and this is really intended for the small NEM pair storage systems. So as I mentioned before, metering costs can be high relative to the total cost of installing these systems. If we have to meter everything to account for where energy is coming from and where energy is going, to ensure NEM integrity. And so that's generally what the rationale for this was, and this came in the same 2014 decision by the CPUC that determined that some of the risks of gaming were determined to be pretty slim, and this was basically a policy determination by the commission that the costs of these systems are just too high that we can make a reasonable exemption for these cases, and instead develop an estimation methodology to determine what the maximum allowable NEM bill credits could be generated from a small NEM pair storage system. And they used a tool that was developed in the CSI program to determine that. There's been definitely a lot of challenges related to developing this calculator, and so the commission is actually moving toward a different model where we're rather than looking at customer specific estimation using a calculator, they're actually looking at a single per kW profile for each climate zone. And so it's being more simplified in that way because of some of the implementation challenges and some of the concerns about some of the inputs into the calculator. And so it's administratively definitely more simple. It achieves its intended objective of allowing for these systems to interconnect without metering everything. I think another key consideration for NEM pair storage systems is for at least the storage component, regardless of whether or not the pair storage system is participating in the NEM program or not, they're eligible to receive the self-generation incentive program incentives. And I won't dive into the details of the SGIP incentives, and some of these numbers on the incentive rates are actually outdated, but since it was intended to be, the incentive rate is actually intended to reflect how much uptake there is into the market, and so the rates are actually different, and for each of the utilities we're actually in different steps. And so I wouldn't take this as reflecting the status of the program today, but basically it's an incentive program that's structured to provide upfront or some combination of upfront plus performance-based incentives that are paid out over time for the storage system. And this is really, I think, important to support the deployment of pair storage systems, in addition to the incentives from being able to arbitrage TOU rates and take advantage of NEM export rates and NEM compensation rates to support the case for storage deployment. And really one of the key reasons for the NEM 2.0 tariff and the decision that came out for that is the state is moving toward changing a lot of the rate structures in each of the utility service territories toward later periods. Many of the most recent TOU periods was from a 12 to 6 p.m. period, but as we've had more and more solar generation coming onto the grid in California, really the peak periods are shifting more and more, and the cost drivers are shifting more toward the 4 to 9 period. And so in recent decisions that we've seen from SCE and SDG&E, and recently also with PG&E, we're seeing that 4 to 9 period shift, and this is, I think, one of the key economic drivers for pairing storage systems as well. And also, related to the PG&E service territory, there's actually been many interesting rates that have been proposed. There are storage-specific rates that have been proposed as opt-in rates that could be considered for these systems. One that, for example, a new option S rate has been approved. There's a cap set on how many customers can actually subscribe to that rate, since it's more of a trial rate to see what the potential impacts of customers on this rate could be, and at a later time assessing any cost shift concerns that might be had. But basically, it allows greater certainty for these systems, and for C&I customers who are on them through these peak daily demand charges. Instead of adopting non-coincident demand charges, these peak daily demand charges provide that certainty and allow for these NEM pair storage systems to really get value by shifting load to later in the day, while avoiding any demand charges across any period of the day throughout the month. There's been another number of other rates I won't go into, but definitely can answer if people have questions. And in the backdrop of all of this is, even as a lot of the C&I rates are being adopted and approved, the state is working through residential rate design window applications at the very moment to implement default TOU rates. And there's been a whole host of rates being proposed by each of the utilities, but generally aligning with the same theme of shifting peak TOU periods to 4 to 9. And so each of these rates are really incentivizing NEM pair storage systems. And lastly, just wanted to touch upon this really quickly because I thought this was a very interesting application of NEM pair storage systems, is that we're seeing NEM pair storage systems being considered for eligibility in utility solicitations. And even as they're being considered as eligible, there's definitely been challenges in really evaluating bids from NEM pair storage systems to deliver, for example, distribution deferral services. Systems that can potentially provide additional value other than the value that's being provided under NEM. Is that given the all-in quote unquote all-in rate from the NEM compensation that includes avoided capacity, energy, distribution capacity, etc. There's been challenges in assessing the incrementality of bids, since it's hard to determine from a planning perspective what has already been accounted for in terms of what the value is that comes from that NEM compensation, and what any incremental additional compensation should be afforded to these systems. Across some of the solicitations, we're seeing that they're really only considering the non-NEM portion at the site, and so as long as the pair storage system is actually separately metered and is generally not part of NEM, those systems can be considered incremental. And so that's an interesting development. There's still a lot of uncertainty here. We haven't really seen any actual procurements yet in these solicitations for NEM systems, but at least in a pilot solicitation, the demand response auction mechanism, which is intended to test out how demand response resources can be procured for and deliver RA capacity. We've actually had one project, the Sunrun project, that has been procured and is being tested for that. Generally, I know one of the questions for this webinar was who has the capacity rights for these NEM pair storage systems. These NEM systems generally do not provide RA capacity, at least here in California, because they're viewed as generally reducing RA capacity requirements. So lastly, to wrap up, I think some of the key takeaways and lessons learned is, California has made a lot of progress in establishing metering configurations, and they're exploring software and firmware control schemes to ensure NEM integrity and gaming concerns and address gaming concerns. I think these are important, and at least the California CISA agrees with that principle. And there should be a lot of consideration on ways that we can reduce the cost barriers for pairing storage to NEM systems, even though time of use periods and time of use rates are generally incentivizing some of that economically. At least on the residential side, there's still the differentials aren't significant enough at the moment, where the self-generation incentive program incentives actually provide tremendous value, and any reasonable exemptions for small residential systems definitely support the economic case there. And also, future uncertainties are related to whether NEM and NEM pair storage systems are eligible for solicitations to gain additional value. I know the commission, actually, we had a discussion in one of the proceedings on wanting to have NEM systems not to be able to provide additional value and be able to potentially get off NEM by being more and more viable and eligible for these utility solicitations. And lastly, NEM 3.0 is just ahead. We're going to kickstart a new proceeding in 2019. There's a lot of work in terms of some of the locational and avoided cost values methodologies that are being developed in various other proceedings, like the DRP, the Distributed Resource Plan, and its sister proceeding, the IDR proceeding, which is really looking at sourcing mechanisms, as well as the system planning proceeding that's looking at the IRP proceeding that's looking at avoided cost values and avoided GHG values as well. So a lot to look forward to. And I think, Todd, that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions now or later on.
Great, thanks very much. We do have a question or two here, and for those who have joined us since we went over the housekeeping at the beginning, feel free to electronically raise your hand at any time if you'd like to verbally ask a question. We won't require you to state your name or social security number or anything. You can just ask a question, or you can type it in. So Jen, we had a question about, you mentioned the sort of non-bypassable charges that aren't completely totally assessed to NEM customers. The question is, how does the utility know the energy use for non-bypassable charges? And is there any requirement that the solar output be metered so that the customer can be billed on the sum of the metered use plus the array output?
Yeah, so a lot of these non-bypassable charges are actually assessed on a per kWh basis. And so since the utilities do an annual true-up on how much they should refund and pay them customers, I think the key change there was, rather than looking at the net amount of electricity that the customer obtains from the utility, they actually looked at the total amount of electricity the customer obtains from the utility, and then they assessed a per kWh charge for NEM customers. I think there was one analysis that showed that the costs are generally added about 3 cents per kWh cost to NEM customers, which translates to like a $6 to $8 per month average, cost that's incurred by NEM customers. I missed the second part of the question.
No, I think the question was, is there a requirement that the solar output be metered so that the sum of the metered use plus the array can be added up to come up with a charge?
Yeah, definitely. in any of the metering requirements, generally there's the NEM eligible generation actually has to be metered. And so that amount is actually accounted for. It's when we look at NEM plus storage, NEM pair storage systems, we're seeing either you have to have a NEM eligible generator plus meters on the load and the PCC to be able to account for how much energy is going into the load versus to the storage versus being exported. And so they do an accounting for where energy is going. And so they're able to capture how much is actually NEM eligible generation.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to unmute Seth. Seth, you should be unmuted now. Go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thanks, Todd. This is Seth Mullendor with Clean Energy Group. Jen, I had a question. I actually talked to someone this morning in, they were doing a project in SCE territory. They chose not to connect the energy storage to the solar system. This was a larger than 10 kilowatt system. They said they chose not to do that because of the added headache of the permitting and interconnection process, mainly interconnection process on SCE side, saying that connecting solar and storage together could add an additional 6 months to the interconnection process with reviews and studies that had to be done. Just wondering if that's something that you've run into.
Yeah, we've definitely seen those concerns, since adding that storage component definitely adds interconnection review processes to it. And so one of the considerations for NEM plus storage systems that we've been seeing from certain members from the California CISA is that they're actually trying to push submit interconnection applications where they have basically no storage export, because when the Rule 21 process really looks at the load impact and the generation impacts for storage, and generally in California for standalone or paired storage systems, having a non-export configuration definitely supports quicker interconnection review, since you're really only looking at the load side of that storage system and making sure that you're not charging during when the customer load is peaking in many cases. And so we've had members who are generally pursuing an approach where they propose no storage export configurations, and they do that with non-export relays or inverter controls, basically to have the storage device strictly discharged to on-site load. And so it avoids some of the NEM integrity concerns and also the interconnection review process. It definitely expedites that by not having to conduct extra grid impact studies.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so we are running short on time, so I do want to get this turned over to Jaime so that we can get the second part of the presentation. And folks, continue to raise your hands or type in questions as we go, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Jaime, you're up.
Great. Afternoon, everyone. Seeing if my slides will go here. There we go. So it's great to be here with you all. This is Jaime Dickerson from the Northeast Clean Energy Council. A warm hello to all of our state agency attendees and especially our colleagues from here in the Northeast. Let me just change my slide. So my organization, NECEC, is the Northeast Clean Energy Council. We are a business policy and innovation organization for the clean energy industry here in the Northeast. We're a member-based nonprofit made up of almost 200 clean energy companies and early-stage startups, and our mission really is to make the Northeast one of, if not the best places to start and scale a clean energy company. So let's dive right in. I know we've got a short amount of time, so I want to make sure we can cover as much ground as possible. Here in New England, net metering has obviously been a major driver of distributed solar growth. each of the 6 New England states has some form of net metering policy. And we certainly do hope that each policy can be updated to reflect greater sophistication with locational and temporal value, but also incorporating new rules to add emerging technologies and innovative use cases for producing, storing, and consuming electricity. So if you look at the statutes and the regulations on this slide, there's really no mention or very little mention of or references to energy storage. It's clear that the development of the original NEM statutes and even some of the recent refinements predated the current commercialization and awareness of storage that we're seeing today. By the same token, however, net metering statutes shouldn't necessarily need to explicitly reference energy storage, since in these net metering regimes, storage is not a renewable generator that could or would be eligible for net metering by itself. Of course, though, program statutes and rules need not reference every single type of customer, technology, or equipment or appliance that could interact with net metering production and consumption behind the meter. One noteworthy example, of course, would be electric vehicles, which themselves, of course, are a means of storing energy too. So where does battery energy storage fit into this puzzle? In 2017, really started to see multiple states in the Northeast start to take a close look at this question, with several prominent dockets and inquiries starting to lay the groundwork for the first ripples of net metering and battery storage deployment, with hopes for bigger waves of deployments on the horizon. I don't want to spend too much time on the background benefits of storage, but suffice it to say that the wide range of beneficial storage use cases that will rely on the availability of net metering really was a major driver of the state agency and PUC interest here. Use cases ranging from, shifting solar production, lowering peak demand, microgrids resilience, renewables integration, buildings as a grid asset, wholesale market participation, non-wires alternatives, the list goes on and on. So this slide lays out a snapshot of some of the state proceedings that have concluded or are still underway, first in Mass and Rhode Island, and along with several pertinent efforts in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. I'd really strongly encourage agency officials in peer states to use these dockets as a resource for getting up to speed on the issues and hopefully identify some points that can be resolved early on and leapfrogged, as it were. So petitions from residential solar providers really got things rolling in 2017. In Mass, a Tesla petition sought emergency resolution for residential NEM plus storage in May of 2017, after a National Grid utility notice indicated that facilities paired with storage would not be eligible to net meter. Tesla sought a limited ruling on net metering systems less than 60 kW, charging only from the net metering source and no energy storage export. The DPU did issue a favorable advisory ruling, though not a full declaratory order, in September of 2017 that did allow these limited project configurations to move forward. So that was some good early progress. Shortly thereafter, a very similar petition was filed in Rhode Island by Tesla and Sunrun. Rhode Island's PUC ruled favorably a few months later in late 2017, affirming the eligibility for PV or net metering systems less than 25 kW. Again, charging only from the net metering system, the battery, and in this instance, systems were not allowed to be on time of use rates at this early juncture. Both states indicated an intent to open a broader net metering and storage inquiry real soon. So Massachusetts was the first to act quickly to open up a follow-on proceeding, and this new docket 17-146 would really become the major arena for a broad and deep investigation of net metering plus storage issues. And as we speak, stakeholders like us are awaiting resolution in the docket any day now. You see on the slide here some of the topics that were raised by the DPU, fundamental questions like, should renewable facilities paired with storage even be able to net meter? Questions around wholesale market participation, as Jen mentioned, concerns around net metering integrity, and whether any charging and export restrictions would be needed to preserve NEM integrity. Also questions about enforcement and implications for the net metering caps in Massachusetts. So NECEC, my organization, we led a coalition of clean energy stakeholders, SEIA, Vote Solar, CBANE, ESA, in submitting joint comments to the DPU. We believe there was really a strong policy rationale and a firm legal basis for the department to find in favor of eligibility for net metering facilities paired with storage systems. You see from some of the quotes here, we argued for a broad range of net metering and storage pairings to be eligible. Basically, in our mind, any determination of ineligibility would really conflict with both the existing statute and with the Baker-Polito administration's policy support for storage as a driver of benefits, system benefits. We also pointed out that ineligibility or burdensome restrictions would really seriously undermine the deployment of Solar+Storage under both net metering and the forthcoming Smart Incentive Program, which is still being rolled out. So the DPU's notice in 17-146 included what we viewed as a problematic expectation that eligibility would be limited to instances where the battery was charging from the net metering system only and no export to the grid from storage would be allowed. To us, those restrictions represent just one of several pathways that should be recognized as adequately safeguarding against gaming and manipulation, as the DPU put it, of the net metering rules. We argued that the DPU should permit 4 broad categories of configurations for systems seeking to qualify as net metering eligible, provided that they adopt additional safeguards. So what the DPU expected basically is represented in box 1 here, and building from there to the top right in scenario 2, net metering plus exports, that would allow storage charge from the net metering facility only, but with the ability for the storage to export to the grid. On the opposite side of the coin, in scenario 3, a non-export scenario, storage should be given the ability to charge from both the net metering source and the grid, but the storage would be prevented from exporting to the grid. And then finally, the most sophisticated or complicated scenario would be scenario 4, the net generation output meter NJOM arrangement, which would give flexibility for the storage to charge both from the net metering resource and the grid, and for the storage to export to the grid if needed. So these options, which I'll sort of explain in more detail in a moment, span a spectrum from most restrictive and lowest cost to least restrictive and most expensive to the customer or project developer for the incremental cost of adding metering, relays, or potential other physical infrastructure. In our view, customers and developers should be given the option to decide whether the additional costs are worth the value they unlock to them, and as such could always choose a simpler configuration rather than be required to incur the incremental costs associated with a more sophisticated system arrangement. I wanted to provide here at least one visual of a basic system configuration before going into more detail on the 4 scenarios that we advocated for. Obviously, architectures and configurations will vary in structure to meet customer needs, including the AC coupled versus DC coupled choice shown here. These are obviously very simplistic residential illustrations, but they show how both instances allow the customer to change the DC solar output into AC and feed it back into the grid, use it for their appliances in their home, or potentially store it within batteries as DC for later use. Things obviously get a lot more complicated quickly beyond simple residential arrangements. Our work in Massachusetts really has revealed that it's not uncommon and actually quite common for larger C&I customers to have multiple customer loads behind a single retail meter or on a single utility service drop with multiple meters that can be aggregated and billed as a single account. It gets very, very confusing and complicated very quickly, especially as there is increasing interest for sort of campus-style arrangements, multiple solar net metering projects or facilities behind a single meter, multiple potential batteries, EV charging stations, and more. So, where does the increasing sophistication lead us? And in our mind, the answer is really a need to preserve multiple options and flexibility for different configurations. And that brings us right back to the 4 scenarios that we put forward, which were structured to preserve that flexibility and optionality, but also to address the concerns raised by the DPU around, again, what they referred to as gaming and manipulation. Those concerns really boil down, in our mind, to making sure that net metering credits are never awarded to power that was charged from the grid. Put another way, it basically involves making sure that net metering credits awarded do not exceed the production from the eligible renewable net metering resource during a given billing or crediting period. And we supported rules to accomplish this in all 4 of our scenarios. Our member companies definitely reiterated the preference that Jin spoke to, which is avoiding a default preference to meter everything rules, a need to preserve multiple options for compliance that include software and inverter control based and accounting based compliance where possible, rather than mandating the installation of expensive meters and other physical infrastructure in all instances. So scenario 1, again, this would basically see the Tesla petition ruling expanded up from 25 kW to 2 megawatts, which is the size limit for net metering facilities in Mass. This would be the strictest restriction on system operations, but would require no additional costs for customers. Scenario 2 would feature a battery charged exclusively by the net metering facility, but with the ability for the battery to export to the grid. This could be accomplished through DC coupled inverter arrangements or AC sub-metering and accounting to demonstrate that charging is only happening when the net metering facility is producing enough to charge the storage system. For scenario 3, this would feature expanded charging ability for the battery to charge from either the net metering facility or the grid, but with a prohibition on exports from the battery. Both software and hardware options would suffice for complying with this scenario, including less costly software-based options and more costly physical infrastructure options. And then finally, scenario 4, as I mentioned, is the most sophisticated configuration. This would be designed to enable the battery to both charge from and export to the grid. This would be accomplished while maintaining proper net metering crediting via a net generation output meter arrangement. And that NJOM solution would require the utility bidirectional meter, but additional sub-metering for the generation, the load, and the storage, so that the amount of energy from the net metering facility could be independently measured and determined. And here the basic rule is that the net metering credit is the lower of the 2 readings between the net metering production and the export at the bidirectional meter. So I want to move quickly along here. I know we're running out of time. DOER, we were really heartened to see them basically endorse the 4 scenarios that we put forward, and that gives us confidence that the DPU will look favorably upon these configurations in their forthcoming order. The final major topic I want to highlight just quickly is one Jin mentioned briefly too, the issue of capacity rights. Capacity rights issue has a very unique history in Massachusetts, and it did become a challenging sticking point in the course of the 146 proceeding. To sort of gloss over some of the background, we eventually argued strongly that the capacity of a co-located storage system must be expressly excluded from the capacity attributes of the net metering facility, whose title in Massachusetts, the distribution companies were entitled to at least have a claim on. Ultimately, after months of comments and negotiations, we and a number of other parties submitted a joint compromise proposal to the DPU to hopefully resolve the capacity issues. And that compromise proposal would clarify that storage capacity rights remain with the storage owner. It would give future system owners the opportunity to buy out the net metering solar capacity rights to keep that under their ownership. And it would ensure that EDC control of solar capacity would never convey any right to discharge or otherwise dictate the operations of the co-located storage facility, which of course could cause very, very important problems, very significant problems for storage control and flexibility. So where do things stand? Well, we're waiting with bated breath for a trio of orders from the DPU, the net metering plus storage rules in phase 1 of 146, the main smart tariff proceeding order in 17-140, and then the accompanying ruling in phase 2 of 146 on the capacity rights. It's been any day now for a couple of weeks, so we are eager to see these orders come out, hopefully in the next week or so in mid-September. So I won't read through these verbatim, but these are some of the takeaways that we hope other states can learn from and emulate as they look to develop and refine their net metering policies and accompanying rules. One point I will raise, the last bullet there, I mentioned being cognizant of how other alternative tariff structures will affect the value proposition and benefits of storage. One such alternative we've seen come up, for example, in Connecticut in the legislation earlier this year, is the consideration of a buy-all, sell-all arrangement. And while it's not impossible to incorporate storage there, you know, it'll greatly constrain the beneficial operation if the PV production cannot be stored and consumed on site. So we're hoping that's one reason why a sort of more net metering-esque, a robust net metering-esque option will be maintained in states like Connecticut and other states too. So we've got near-term opportunities in the Northeast. The follow-on docket I mentioned, Rhode Island, the two proceedings in Connecticut, which will be implementing their new successor tariff and net metering program and regimes. So a lot of near-term activity over the next 12 to 18 months. With that, I think I'll wrap up. I'm sorry we didn't have time for any time before the end of the hour, but I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes. And as always, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call if you have any follow-up questions as well. Back to you, Todd.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to Jen. I think Jen said he had a hard stop at the hour, but I can stay for a few minutes. If anybody who is on the line, any of our attendees have a question, if you'd like to electronically raise your hand and ask a question or type it in. I wanted to ask one thing. You know, there was a lot of discussion about added costs of meters and, you know, various other types of solutions to prevent, you know, to sort of safeguard the integrity of net metering, relays and such, software, switches and so forth. What are some of the costs? Can you give us just an example? I mean, what added cost does a meter, you know, bring to a system as compared with a, you know, a relay or just a software solution?
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, that's a great question. I tried to do some digging around before the webinar and unfortunately don't have a great sort of single source to cite for sort of range of costs, but I can say that the costs are, you know, not inconsequential, especially for the more sophisticated arrangements like NJOM, but not so outrageously high compared to other system hard costs. And in fact, our solar and storage companies expressed a strong willingness to pay for those additional costs on their own to unlock the value that they would provide if it made sense for a particular customer and configuration. At the same time, though, I think all of our members agreed that there's a general preference to preserve, where acceptable, software-based control setting options, which obviously don't have any hard, you know, capital expenditure associated with them for physical infrastructure. So that's a good question, though, and hopefully we can try and dig up some harder numbers in the future.
Okay, and this whole question of other programs, you know, you mentioned there are a number of dockets in Massachusetts, for example, that we're waiting to see resolution on. To what extent do the storage and net metering questions that have been discussed overlap or impact, or are they impacted by other policy and program you know, developments that may be going on in states? In other words, if you've got a net metering, you know, storage and net metering docket at the same time as you're trying to develop an adder for storage in your solar incentive program, or you're trying to look at whether to have an incentive in your energy efficiency program or something like that, to what degree do those interlock, and do they need to be addressed sort of simultaneously, or can you just sort of do the net metering in isolation?
It's a great question, and I think we've really seen that borne out in Massachusetts, where everything from the ACES grants that Mass CEC and DOER awarded, I think like half of those projects were Solar+Storage, and certainly the entire new SMART program is looking to promote solar and storage via a storage adder, and that program is explicitly designed to work in conjunction with net metering for largely for behind the meter projects, but for any type of net metering project that can qualify. So I think so that states don't put the cart before the horse, really doing the dirty work of figuring out the rules for net metering plus storage will unlock future program design options. So whether you're pursuing or whether your state is still in a sort of an SREC-based incentive program, or you're moving to a tariff-based program, or whether you want to add some type of storage rebate program to your energy efficiency, peak demand reduction offerings, having the foundation of the rules set and in place and known to the market for net metering plus storage will greatly alleviate the headaches of program design and implementation sort of across the board. So I think that would be my recommendation.
Great. Well, it suggests some future programming on our part to look at how various programs and policy and regulatory structures interact around net metering incentives and rec programs and so forth. Well, thanks to everybody for attending. We've gone a little bit over, so we're going to wrap this up. Thanks so much to Jen and Jaime for their wonderful presentations. Feel free to contact us if you have a question or want a copy of the slides or something. And I'll turn this over to Samantha if there are any last words before we end.
Thanks, Todd. So we do have some webinars coming up. Several of these webinars are, as this webinar was today, exclusive for CISA members and the CISA Energy Storage Working Group. So the two webinars that are exclusive are the ones on October 5th, which is on the topic of offshore wind plus energy storage, and the webinar on November 8th, which is about energy storage in the Clean Peak Standard. You can find details about those webinars on our website at cisa.org, and you can also email us for more information. You can email Todd at cleanegroup.org or Sam at cleanegroup.org, and we will get back to you if you have any questions. But that's it for us today. Thanks very much, everybody, for attending, and we hope to see you at the next one.